Welcome. Today we begin a sermon series on the Psalms, and there are all kinds of good reasons why a church community should look at the book of Psalms. But I'm convinced, without wanting this to sound like it's some magic formula or abracadabra kind of stuff, I'm convinced that there is real spiritual power in the lives of those who learn to read and to pray the Psalms. And so we're going to be doing this series not so much as a devotional series on the Psalms, but we want to rather deal with it, look at it as a pilgrimage into honesty with God, and a pilgrimage into honesty, a deeper honesty with ourselves, and a pilgrimage into kind of the chemistry between those two things. A part of the power of the Psalms is that in them we meet ourselves unmasked in both the ugly truth of who we can be as human beings, and also the magnificent glory and beauty that God has placed within us. And through this honesty, we discover as well the truth of who God is. We discover that He is, I think, greater than we mostly imagine Him to be. Our eyes get reopened into the beauty of who God is. And at other times, we discover God to be frustratingly different from the God we really wish He would be for us. In this series, I will be helped in my reading and thinking by one of the world's foremost Old Testament scholars, a guy by the name of Walter Brueggemann. And Brueggemann himself has relied heavily on the work of Gunkel, Mowinkel, and Westermann, who are regarded as the foremost scholars of the Psalms. Now, all of that might sound like it's all very academic and heavy, but I absolutely assure you it won't be. So I hope you will come to the series with me, with joy and with anticipation and with an openness to the whispers of God's Spirit. So to begin today, I want to mention three seasons of our lives that Walter Brueggemann identifies for us. Others, I suppose, have done something similar and they've used different words, but we're sticking with Brueggemann's words for today. And Brueggemann says that life, on the one hand, there's a season in our lives that he would call orientation. And that's where our life is oriented well. We're in a good space. Our heart is filled with gratitude. We have a sense of God's blessing in our lives, and so we are well oriented. And then he says there are seasons as well in our lives in which we are disoriented. We are in a season of disorientation. And that's normally a time in life when life is filled with some kind of anguish. And through that anguish we experience hurt and suffering. We touch or taste death, bereavement. And with all of those kinds of things, not those alone, but with those kinds of things, come these feelings of rage and self-pity and hatred and resentment. And then Brueggemann says that the third season, the third state we live our lives in, is what he calls reorientation. And that's where we live life surprised with unexpected joys, unexpected blessings in the midst of real challenges. We find, for example, new life after some experience of pain. So I think the grief of bereavement, and we suddenly begin to sense new life and hope after a while, or after a divorce. You begin to think that the world has come to an end, and then you begin to sense new moments of life, and he would call that time reorientation, beginning to see new life again. But then he makes what I think is perhaps the most helpful, or certainly was for me the most helpful thought for today's consideration. And he says to us that it's not just about those three seasons, but what also matters is the movement between those seasons. In other words, it's about what happens to us when we live in a life of blessing, we live in a life of contentment when all is well with the world, and then suddenly, or perhaps not so suddenly, but it moves to a time of anguish where some trouble besets our lives. And that's a different dynamic in our lives. And the same thing happens that when we've been living in a season of anguish for a long time, and then those moments of joy and surprise we spoke about a moment ago, when that starts happening, that's another season of transition. And so in a sense we're dealing with 5 different things, those 3 and then the 2 transition times. Next week we're going to look at what's known as the complaint songs. And most of those complaint psalms, as we call them, were written as the psalmist's life was turning from peace to chaos, from that blessing to trouble. And then a little later in the series, we'll look at some of the poetry written as the psalmist was finding that new life emerging after a season of pain into a season of reorientation. And so the Psalms are about our lives in the company of God as we live in and move between seasons of settledness and anguish and gratitude, seasons of order, disorder, reorder, or to use other words again, seasons of peace and then chaos and then renewal, seasons of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. I hope you're still with me. Stay with me. We're going to get to the psalm in a moment. But one quick thing before we move on. Now, those seasons and movements that we've been speaking about are not a fixed thing. It's not like some route we take and then it's done. It's not a one-off experience. In life, we are always moving between them all the time. So right at this moment, your life is either oriented or disoriented or reoriented, or you're in between one or two of those three, if you know what I mean. All of us are in some place on that spectrum. And I think it's important to know that that's going on all the time for us. So today, we've spent quite a lot of time as a way of introducing the series. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at that. So for today, we're going to spend just a few minutes just looking at Psalm 104 as an illustration, as an example of a psalm of orientation, of when the psalmist's life felt like he was blessed and all was well with his soul and everything was in order and everything was in place. And by looking at 4 characteristics of this psalm, I hope it'll help us to read the psalms with some insight in the future. So firstly, in psalms of orientation, as we've already hinted, life is not troubled. When you look at a psalm of orientation, the psalmist doesn't have a sense of life being troubled or threatened by trouble. He doesn't feel there are enemies around him. All is well ordered, life is good, and things are just as God intended them to be. So if we look at Psalm 104, you can hear how the psalmist feels everything is in place. He says of God, "You set the earth on its foundations so that it shall never be shaken." So everything's in place. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. Speaking of water, the waters stood above the mountains, and then at your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take to flight. They rose up to the mountains and then ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. God has everything in place, says the psalmist, and by implication, so too my life. All is well, all is in its place. And then the offshoot of that, the benefit of that, is in a world like that, when we have that sense of the world, then we live without fear. We can go to bed at night with a deep sense of assurance that, of course, the sun will rise again in the morning, because God is faithful and God is good and everything is in order. We can go to bed assured that God is generous and that he will reliably and consistently provide for us, as he always has in the past. Again, back to the psalm, listen to these wonderful words. The psalmist writes, "You make springs gush forth in the valleys, they flow between the hills, and listen to the purpose for the water, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst." It's the donkeys, the wild donkeys get watered and fed by God. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. In other words, the earth is glad for all God's goodness towards it. I love these next sentences. You cause the grass to grow, and he has the purpose for the cattle, and plants for people to use, to bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the human heart, and oil to make the face shine or to soften the beard, and bread to strengthen the human heart. Everything's well. God has put everything in place. He provides. We can rely on it. Nothing threatens. The second feature of a psalm of orientation is the psalmist knows, because no human being can't, the psalmist knows that life isn't always quite this perfect as he describes it. He knows that life can be turned upside down, disoriented. He knows it's possible. But for now, as he writes, He puts that awareness aside. And the reason he does it is because a community of faith, and for that purpose as well, individuals on their own, but a community of faith cannot thrive and grow in an atmosphere of anxiety or fear. You'll never grow if you just always are worried that something's out to get you. I know people who live like that, and it's a terrible way to live with a constant sense of anxiety. And I don't mean where people struggle with mental health issues around it. I mean particularly just that sense of imagining that everyone's out to get you all the time. And so the psalmist declares in this, he declares the goodness of God. And the psalms like these, Brueggemann says, create a sacred canopy over a community, protecting a community of faith. It's a covering, it's like a roof. And it allows not only for the people to live without fear, but it allows God to therefore keep working in people's lives because they aren't fearful, they aren't filled with anxiety. And he can keep working not only in his people, but he can keep working through his people to make a difference in the world. And so these psalms, the second observation is these psalms come to us as a canopy to protect the community and the individuals within that community so that their faith can thrive. The third observation about psalms of orientation is really a warning to us as we read them. Brueggemann says that psalms like these were most likely written by people who were well off, who were in comfortable positions, for whom life was already relatively easy. And then along with that, as we know in our own society today, that people who are well off are often the most powerful people in the society too. They're the ones who hold most of the cards. And therefore, the warning is, psalms like these can be used to ignore the sufferings of others. We can pretend that all is well in the world because it's good in my world, or relatively good in my world. And we can choose then to ignore the sufferings of others. And that, says Brueggemann, is a risk when it comes to psalms of orientation. It's all right with me, Jack, and the rest can get on with their lives on their own. There's this term, this modern term, or for me it feels like a modern term, called it's gaslighting. And gaslighting, as best I understand it, means we tell people that all is well when obviously it isn't, even when you can see it, even when you just keep telling them that what they're seeing isn't true, and that's gaslighting, and the politicians are fond of doing that. And we need to be very careful that we don't use these sacred writings to do that to the world, not just to our church communities, but to the world. Religion is often, as most of us know, is often used to lie to people. I beat this drum a lot, but I'll say it again. Religion can be used to promise people healing, or promise people wealth, or promise people marriage partners, or promise people new careers, and so on. And the thing that we need to pay attention to, and I know it's not exclusively so, but when you look at the people who mostly preach that kind of stuff, they are the people who own the private jets. And so therefore it's fine for them to make these promises to the rest of the world, to the poor person who gives in their wedding ring so the preacher can buy his new jet. It's a sober and good warning for us to hear that we should not use psalms like these to squash the reality of people's suffering. And we'll talk more about that next week. But now we must be cautious, despite that warning, we must be cautious not just to toss it aside or ignore them. These beautiful psalms, these psalms of orientation, are given to us as a gift, as a canopy over us, and they are true. They hold truth. They help us to cling to the truth sometimes in difficult times, that God is good all the time. And they help us to know that God's purposes are resilient in this mad world, in this difficult world. We have some truth to hold. We have some solid ground to stand on. We are able to be assured through psalms like this that God will work to make things good. He'll take whatever comes his way and he will work. And this kind of psalm builds that confidence and that faith in us. They keep our hope alive. So we give thanks to God for these psalms of orientation, even if there is some risk within some of them or the way people use them. And then the last observation we want to make about these psalms of orientation is that they typically remind us We come to know the truth about God. We come to know the truth about God's goodness, not through some great religious revelation, not through some shining light in the middle of a worship service. What I love about the Psalms, with Psalms like these, is that they most often describe for us the goodness of God in an incredible ordinariness, in an incredible everydayness. We come to know that God is dependable because of what happens in the routine of life. Can I turn us once more to the Psalm? Listen, the psalmist says, the trees of the Lord are watered abundantly. The trees. Wherever you see a tree, the tree belongs to the Lord, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. And in those same trees, the birds build their nests. The stork has its home in the fir trees. Here at our church property, we've got 2 Egyptian geese. And those geese belong to God. That's what the psalmist is telling us. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the conies. In South African language, that's the dassies. The rocks are there for the God even cares about dassies. Isn't that fantastic? And you've made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows it's time for setting. And you make darkness. Isn't that beautiful? God makes darkness, not in the spiritual sense, but he sends us to bed at night when it's night. And then all the animals of the forest come creeping out. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food. Where do the young lions look for their food? They look to God for their food. That's news for the bokkies in the Kruger Park, I know. But the psalmist has the sense of going, even the lions are fed by God. And then when the sun rises, the lions withdraw and they lie down in their dens. And this final, we just stop, it's not the end of the psalm, but people go out to their work and to their labor until the evening. Even our work is a part of God's grace and mercy to our lives, that we have purpose and reason to work. And so these Psalms of orientation are a wonderful, wonderful gift to us. They're the canopy over our head. They help to build faith. There's a caution in them, but they come to us as a firm reminder of the goodness of God. So I wonder if you'd say this with me, even in your home, this little saying that is popular around the world. God is good, and you respond with the words, all the time. And I say to you, all the time, and you respond with the words, God is good. God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. God be with you.